Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Preeti Chauhan. I'm one of the professors here at John Jay College in the psychology department. And this morning we heard Rick Rosenfeld and Rob Fernango's analysis and presentation on stop, question, and frisk and associations of crime at the census tract level. Now, David Weisburd is going to go down to the microspatial level and discuss his results on analysis at the street segment level. And after that, we'll follow up with a panel of discussants and then open question and discussion. So.
Yeah, thank you very much, Preeti. I was thinking as I walked up here that the process of doing this work, which we've been, since Rick first invited me, was 2 or 3 years ago, I think, has been a kind of difficult process in some ways because of the reasons that Rick noted at the beginning, which is trying to observe the world and then divide up things that are very much interrelated is not always easy. It actually reminded me of a story that, am I? Okay. While she's doing that, I'll tell a story. Never mind. Okay. It's very noisy. Is that the? Anyway, you're not doing it. We're not. You're trying to throw off my. Sorry. No. Okay. So the story goes like this. It was a joke running around Israel for a while. And the way it starts is this guy dies and he goes to God and God says, hey, I'm sorry, this is not where you're going to spend eternity. And this fellow says, oh, that's terrible news. And God says, wait, but you have two alternatives. You can go to regular hell or you can go to Israeli hell. So the fellow says, well, how do I choose? And God says, well, I'll let you visit each place, and then you'll tell me where you want to spend eternity. So the fellow says, well, how do I do that? And God says, well, go to sleep, and when you wake up, you'll be in regular hell. So he goes to sleep, he wakes up, and it's Dante's Inferno, you know, pitchforks, hot, steam all around, etc. And he looks at that, he says, God, and God says, what? He says, well, let me see the other place. Let me see Israeli hell. So God says, okay, go to sleep, and when you wake up, you'll be in Israeli hell. So he goes to sleep, and he wakes up, and it's green hills, children dancing the hora, mangalim, barbecues. It's really nice, you know, and he says, God, and God says, what? He says, this is where I want to spend eternity. So God says, go to sleep, and when you wake up, you'll be in Israeli hell for eternity. So he goes to sleep, and he wakes up, and it's worse than the first place. More pitchforks, more devils, hotter, more steam. And he says, God. And God says, what? He says, this isn't where I was yesterday. And God says, well, yesterday you were a tourist. So I think that doing something like this, for me, is a little like that. When I do a lot of experimental work too, and I wrote to the discussants, I think on this, when I sent them the slides, something like, only experimental data from now on. But at the same time, I think that a lot of times we don't have access to experimental data. And the question becomes, well, what can we learn from the data we have available? And that's what Rick tried to do, and that's also what I'm trying to do. With all its difficulties and all its assumptions, it's still the case that we want to see what we can learn. Now, I'm examining the effects of SQFs on crime at a microgeographic level, a much more microgeographic level than Rick is talking about. And that approach really develops out of work I did here in New York almost 30 years ago, hard to believe. And what I did was I worked with the Vera Institute of Justice, and they sent me out to look at one of the first community policing programs. What they did was they took 10 police officers. Each of them, they gave a beat, which they defined as about 15 to 20 square blocks, a very small area compared to what people were thinking about earlier, smaller than the census tracts, for example. And in that situation, what we did was I went out with them on this community policing idea where they were supposed to do something about crime. And after a few months, what I realized was that though they had this 20 square block area, which was supposed to be a bad part of town, it was the case that they spent almost all their time on 1 or 2 blocks. So that led me to the idea that if I wanted to really focus in on the effects of what the police are doing and understand it, I had to look at those specific blocks where they're spending all their time. It may be that they were assigned a whole neighborhood, so to speak, in this context, but they were spending their time in just a few blocks. And that idea has kept with me ever since that point, that if we want to get a robust sense of what people are doing, what police are doing and its effects, we have to look to see where they're operating, if they're operating in this same kind of idea of focusing in on a few streets. Let me say this work that I'm going to talk about, and I'll mention them later as well, we've had a team working that included myself, Elise Woodich, who's sitting at that table over there, a very talented graduate student at George Mason University. Sarit Weisburd happens to be my daughter. I'm very proud of her. She's an economist. She's now at the University of Washington postdoc and going back to be a faculty member at Tel Aviv University in economics. Su-Ming Yang from the National Chung Cheng University, who's coming to George Mason actually next year, and Brian Lawton, who's also sitting at that table from George Mason University. Now, Rick mentioned that what we're presenting now is a sort of second stage. This coordinating is going to be hard, which is a second stage of a project that we began much earlier. And in the first stage, what I wanted to know was, well, are SQFs being carried out as a hotspots policing strategy? Now, why was that important? And not only because I'm very interested in hotspots policing, but also because there had been some discussion in New York about whether this strategy was just spread across neighborhoods, sort of without any sense of focus, or was it, as the police were arguing, very focused in on certain places, and were those places with high crime. This work was also supported by the Open Societies Foundations, and here's what we found. Like what I've discovered in Seattle, Sacramento, Tel Aviv, and other cities, crime is very concentrated. A relatively small number of places in New York produce a lot of the crime. So 5% of the street segments in New York produce 50% of the crime at street segments. 5% of the intersections produce over 50% of the crime. And by the way, 1% of the streets produce about 25% of the crime. So crime in New York is not just spread all over the place, it's highly clustered. We would say it's clustered at crime hotspots. When we looked at SQFs, we found similar results. And I'll show you a bit later in the presentation 2 maps that you'll see this as well as I get a bit more into the data. But when we looked at SQFs in New York, we found that 5% of the street segments produced 77% of the SQFs at street segments, and 5% of the intersections produced over 50% of SQFs at intersections. So crime is concentrated at these crime hotspots, if you like. SQFs are concentrated at hotspots. Now, the other question we asked is, well, do those things overlap? No, do they overlap in space? Is one on top of the other? And what we found was they're strongly related, at least. And we did a couple of different analyses. When we looked at correlations, for example, there's a correlation of about 0.60, both at the intersection level and the street segment level in terms of SQFs and crime. From that empirical data, in one sense, you come to the next question, which, okay, what does that mean? Well, there's a really strong body of literature now that hotspots policing is an effective crime reduction strategy, and that it leads generally not to displacement of crime to nearby areas, but rather to what we call a diffusion of crime control benefits. In other words, you have a lot of studies now, a lot of them randomized experiments, that show if you bring police to crime hotspots and you compare that to a randomized control group, the hotspots where the police are have larger crime reductions. And it's also the case that you don't have a displacement of that crime benefit to the areas nearby, or excuse me, you don't have a displacement of crime to the areas nearby. Indeed, the areas nearby tend to get better as well. Now, I'm not going to go into now all the reasons why we think that's the case. A lot of it has to do with the nature of what you're doing at those places, how it affects the areas nearby, et cetera. But the bottom line is that there is this robust literature that says hotspots policing is effective. And it's effective for the most part without displacement. The National Academy of Sciences in 2004 concluded that studies that focus police resources on crime hotspots provide the strongest collective evidence of police effectiveness that's now available. And, the studies haven't stopped. There's a Campbell review. It's done by Anthony Braga and colleagues. And in that review, they come to this same conclusion. Based on about 20 some odd studies, at least half of them randomized experiments. Now, if you put all this together in a kind of logic model, what you'd expect from this logic model is that SQFs would have a crime reduction effect, right? If it's a hotspots policing strategy. Now, of course, there's this, I'll call it later, the elephant in the room, which is there are very strong questions regarding the impacts of SQFs on public trust and citizen perceptions of legitimacy, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that. And that could mean two things. First of all, it says something about, as Rick has called about, an approach can be effective and it can be normatively problematic, but it's also the case that some people posit that if legitimacy is lowered, then it has an impact on long-term crime prevention gains. So it could be you not only have all these crime prevention loops we've already talked about, but it could be that if you're eroding legitimacy, in fact, whatever crime prevention benefit you're getting in the long run in such a program might decline. Now, if we look at the descriptive data, as Rick pointed out, it seems to tell the story we're talking about. Descriptive data is problematic in many ways, but at least it's a picture. And what we did here was we looked only at street segments for the first part, because I wanted to be able to say, well, what is the relationship on specific streets between crime and SQFs? I'm ignoring intersections. That's a bit of a problem here, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But you can see that the two lines, the upper line is the crime axis, the lower line is the SQF axis at street segments, and you can see it tells a story that would seem to apply that as one goes up, the other goes down. In this case, as SQFs go up, crime seems to go down. That's also what Rick presented with slightly different data. Now, the problem in New York, and an additional complication for analysis, is that it's hard to look only at street segments because unlike crime, where a majority of crime is occurring on street segments as opposed to intersections, in New York City, more than half of the SQFs recorded by the NYPD occurred intersections. Now, I put occur in parentheses because I heard some talk that one should beware of the sort of XY coordinate here. In other words, they may be linking a stop to a intersection, but maybe it occurs at the address on the corner of intersection or someplace else. While the data we're given has great specificity, we get an exact XY coordinate, we really have to be careful in the real world. But you could develop a theory, and it's something we've thought about, that an SQF on an intersection actually can have impacts not only on that specific intersection which might occur, but on the street segments that are attached to the intersection. So we also thought about this a bit in terms of, well, what happens if we count on every street segment both of the intersections attached to that street segment? What happens if we count those SQFs as part of the deterrence, And what you get, not surprisingly in a way, is you get about the same figure. In other words, again, this kind of descriptive finding that as, and we've smoothed these curves, by the way, that's why they don't have all those jagged things. Pretty told me to be like very user-friendly, so we thought that smooth curves are more user-friendly. So we smoothed that out, and it's again a nice relationship, not that different than the one if I'd only looked at street segments. Now, Rick's already talked about the problem. In statistical terms, it's described as endogeneity. The problem is that SQFs are brought in this theory because there's crime. So if you look, for example, within a month, you can't tell, in a sense, it could be that SQFs, if you look at the data, it looks like SQFs might be causing crime, et cetera. It's very hard to separate out. Also, in every single place in the city, that relationship may be working differently. If the deterrent impacts of SQFs are short-term, let's say if you bring an SQF and you have a 3 or 4 day or 5 day impact, and then it goes back to where it was before, when you measure the monthly data, think of how complicated that becomes. You're going to miss a lot of the effects. So one of the things this idea would lead us to is you have to be careful of looking at monthly data, for example, if there's a lot happening in short periods. We tried to sort of illustrate that through work that Su-Ming Yang has done, and I should note that David Greenberg helped her a bit with this. and looking at co-integration analyses. Now, the question we asked here are the number of crimes on a street segment co-integrated to the number of SQFs on street segments and adjoining intersections over time, what I just talked about. So to these things, if you look within monthly data, it does look like, it's all happening at the same time over a long period. Now, what she did here was she looked only at very high activity streets during the 6-year period we had data for. And the reason for that was that we said, well, if this is going to be occurring, it's probably occurring most intensely, if you like, at those places that have a lot of SQFs and a lot of crime. At least you have a lot of data to work with. And in the end, she took 103 street segments across 73 months. And well, I'm not going to show you the figures. I did have them in my original slides, I'll note. But as I said, I was told to avoid some of that. But the findings are really that if you look at the individual street segments, crime and SQFs are co-integrated at the monthly level for the majority of high crime street segments we examine. And this is not surprising to us because it fits a sort of theory about what's actually going on here. But it did suggest to us as we moved on to our next set of analyses that you really had to look at time in a more finely kind of divided way because you might miss a lot of what's going on. And of course, we're following an assumption here, and that assumption is that SQFs are a response to crime. Within the monthly area, for example, it'd be very hard. It's very hard to eke that out, but it's at least a theory we have. But whatever we say, this just illustrates it's very hard to disentangle this causal relationship, especially in a long time frame or within a monthly time frame, which is actually not very long, but it led us to the view that we should probably get shorter. Now, I just want to emphasize, I won't say much about it, that this strong relationship between SQFs and crime could mean that there's a third factor that is related to both SQFs and crime. And it's responsible for their relationship. And that's always the case. In other words, maybe SQFs are brought to a particular place for other reasons. It doesn't have to do with crime, and maybe that's correlated with crime. Our problem is, at the microgeographic level that I'm going down to, we don't have such data. There's very little data. In other words, normally if you use census tracts, you can use the census data to find out the percent black and the percent employed and things like that. That data does not exist at a lower level, although I should note that there are some private companies now, and though they're charging a lot, it's useful to think about it, like Info USA. Those are based on models, by the way. And since we're often dealing, the high crime streets are problematic streets, I'm not sure how that works. But that's a digression. My point is, at least at this point, we don't have a lot of data for that. So that's one of the problems that we face. Now, here we basically carried out two methods. How did we get to two methods? We got to two methods in a way because it's not, I think it's because we're sort of eclectic here. We're concerned about the assumptions we're making. We thought maybe if we tried more than one method and they tend to go in the same direction and give you some similar results, and maybe that would give us a kind of sensitivity analysis. At least they're using different assumptions. Maybe that would help us to draw stronger conclusions. And one is a spatio-temporal method, and I'll note that myself and Elise Woodage, who has been working with 5 computers 24 hours a day for months to do this, because the computations are really complex. And Brian Lawton worked on the first group, and Sarit Weisburd and I worked on a fixed effects, a sort of more traditional modeling approach with instrumental variables. Okay, so what about the first approach, the spatio-temporal approach? Now, the reason we liked this and wanted to do something like this was it allowed us to recognize two things we already know. The first is that SQFs are strongly correlated in where they occur. That's what I told you at the beginning. That was our prior research. In other words, they tend to occur in the same place. Well, that's a spatial dimension. It's also the case that we know they're strongly related across time. That's Su Ming's findings, co-integration. That's a time dimension. So we wanted to find a technique that would allow us to integrate both time and space in a dynamic way. Now, they're just now starting to be techniques to develop that. We used a technique that develops out of work that a fellow named Diggle in Germany developed. And I have to say, people in an area like this are very friendly. And that, but once you start working in it, they're interested in other people trying to do it. And he was very, very generous in helping us, and even more generous. was Heather Lynch, this Lynchian-Moorcraft approach. And I should know, where does this come from? I don't know anybody else has done this in criminology like this. Maybe someone can tell me if they know of someone. We found this originally looking at, I think they're called budworms. Is that what they're called? Budworms and fires is what this is about, and how that occurs spatially and temporally. It's an extension, for those of you that know about geographic analysis, of Ripley's K, but it applies Ripley's K in a way that is not usually applied, which is to the time dimension as well. Now, this I certainly should have put up under the previous regulation from Preeti. I'm sorry, Preeti, I forgot to take this one out. That's just the equation that's used, which takes into account both space and time and the space-time interaction. And I should note, by the way, just to go back for a minute, that Diggle, the way the terminology he uses, and I was having trouble, like, what kind of terminology I use, he talks about the space-time interaction. That's the terminology that he's interested in. So you'll hear me use those words. Okay. Now, we used data from the Bronx. Why not the whole city? It was computationally impossible for us to do the whole city. Every time we tried to do more, the things would break down. We spent days on this. It's also the case the Bronx is pretty robust when it comes to crime and pretty robust when it comes to SQFs. We also took a 6 months time period because that also made it computationally a lot easier. You can see there are lots of SQFs here, almost 40,000, and lots of crime incidents, over 50,000. And it's interesting, if you look at the figures on the right, I mean, in a way we should have shown them separately, but the purpose here, in the upper part you have SQFs in the Bronx, and in the lower part you have crime in the Bronx. So you can see what I told you earlier, those, as the colors get more intense, they're more concentrated. You can see that that these two things overlap a lot, right? That's something we already know, but it's nice to see something visually. And you can also see that the SQFs are a bit more tightly clustered than crime is. So this is what Diggle would call the space-time interaction. What you have is the question, if a SQF occurs on day 1, what is the space-time interaction for crime at that place and time over the next 7 days? Now, the statistic here is called D, and unfortunately for us, depending on who you talk to, D could mean different things. A D of 1 is generally considered a benchmark for a very big relationship. Some people argue that it's twice as much as you would expect if there was no relationship, but let's just say 1 is very large. Well, that's not surprising. If SQFs are called to a street because there's crime, then you'd expect the two things to be there on that day, for crime to be there on the day the SQF is brought. Now, what happens a day later? There's a very strong decline in this space-time interaction. And the next day, the decline's even further. And the next day, it even goes below 0, which suggests a place that is likely a crime hotspot ends up having a situation where crime is unlikely to occur there by the 4th day. However, 5th day, 6th day, 7th day, look what happens. Things return to where they might have been originally, at least according to this. Now, this seems to us consistent with a kind of idea that there's a very short-term deterrent effect for SQFs on crime. Now, that deterrent effect may be very large, but it's relatively short-term. And again, suggests the importance of looking at these things within monthly periods as well. Now, you might ask, well, what happens within 200 feet? And I should have mentioned before that for us, the location is an XY coordinate. Often, by the way, since SQFs occur about 70% of the time at intersections, often an intersection. But now let's say, what happens if you go 200 feet in every direction? By the way, 200 feet from an intersection, if you think about it, has a lot of potential. It's 200 feet on each of the attached street segments. And what you see makes sense. On the first day, the relationship between crime, the d-value for crime in that space is lower. Well, because we took, the SQF is being brought to a place that has more crime, if you like. So maybe the place all the way 200 feet away does not have crime on that particular day. And then it follows the pattern of the previous slide, which suggests that for the first couple of days at least, there's not a displacement of crime, there's sort of the same pattern. Maybe having deterrence beyond the intersection, for example, to an area farther out. However, you'll notice that the line then goes like way up. And that's a complicated interpretation, however, and without getting confusing, let me try to say why it's a complicated interpretation. First of all, it does mean that that space-time interaction for crime at that place goes higher than it was on the first day. But if you look at that line we drew, that's the null hypothesis. What that means, kind of, is these are places that tend to have crime along the way. So you're not really comparing it to a situation of no space-time interaction, which would be zero. The null line, as you can see, follows up after a few days. The null line, places that never had that SQF that day, they also tend to go up as well. So it's hard. I guess what I'd say is, I'm not saying that, it doesn't say there's no displacement here, but it suggests that it may not be displacement, it may be something else, a sort of returning to a normal level. So what do these findings tell us? Well, it appears SQFs, at least according to these data, and I'll say something about the limitations in a minute, by the way, appear to disrupt the crime space-time interaction. In the immediate days after an SQF, you see a big decline to virtually no relationship, even a negative relationship. From the 5th day to the 7th day, the space-time interaction seems to return at the site to its original value. And I'm going to say something, so Dan and I thought about this before, Dan and I had spoken. This doesn't take into account contagion in any way, because there could be multiple SQFs, and we're sort of we're averaging out. And it's certainly an issue, and one we're thinking about. Within 200 feet, the crime space-time interaction is lower than the site at the beginning. It makes sense. It declines to 0 and below the null hypothesis line, following the trend itself. So no displacement for a few days at least. And then it seems to increase a lot after a few days. That could be displacement. It may not necessarily be displacement, because just by chance in these places which are sort of hotspots of crime, there would have tended to be an increase in the likelihood of an event after a few days. Now, unfortunately, it's important to talk about limitations. There are limitations here, and one being we don't control for other SQFs or confounding factors that occur within the space and time lags, which may affect the likelihood of a crime event. I'm not sure. The question becomes, can you predict what that bias would lead you to? I think overall it might lead you to find lower effects. It adds a lot of noise, but it could be if there's some strong third variable sticking out here, it could also make the effect decline. A big issue is the data. I heard, and I haven't read this, but I heard through talk that the XY coordinates of the SQFs should not be believed completely. And of course, I'm bringing things down to their exact XY coordinates. And in the work we're doing, that could have a major impact on the kind of analysis I just proposed. Finally, we don't have a control group, really. So although we can draw a null hypothesis line, you saw that before, we don't really have a control as you'd have an experiment. And that, of course, leads to all the limitations that Rick spoke about. Now, the second approach we tried was to use something called a Bartik instrument and fixed effects modeling. Rick used random effects modeling, I noticed. If you use fixed effects modeling, the advantage is that you get to examine the impact of SQFs within street segments, focusing on how the same place changes over the time. So each place is sort of its own control. So that's a nice thing. It's not a real control group or anything, but it's a kind of nice statistical idea. You also, by using Bartik's instrument, you get to solve another problem. So Rick spoke about it. It's difficult to identify the effect of SQFs on crime as opposed to the effect of crime and SQFs. Now, one way we try to deal with that is we use a small time frame. In this analysis, we use weeks, right? So it's a little shorter, but you saw that analysis I showed you before. I mean, things could be happening within that week. If you start on the first day, by the 7th day, all the deterrents could be gone. So Bartik's instrument, if all the assumptions are met, gives us an estimate of the effect of SQFs on street segment, on crime. That is, if you like, purged of the confounding of the loop effect between SQFs and crime. This is one of those magical statistical ideas. It's great. It really works. If the assumptions work, the assumptions are not easy to meet. The assumption here is that the instrument is valid if it influences the outcome variable only through the variable it identifies. The error terms in a statistical term should not be related, and that can happen in a variety of ways, but the key one is that the effect should go through. The instrument should have an impact on SQFs, and through that have an impact on crime, and shouldn't be looping around the other way. That's a kind of hard assumption to meet, but Bartik has this view that if you use geography, you get a stronger ability to make the assumption. And what he suggests is, and this is in economics, it's not in criminology, but he suggests this was in terms of attitudes towards consumption, that attitudes towards consumption in larger areas can be used as an instrument for consumption within a smaller area. Now, what we did in practice, I'm sorry for not carrying the slides. It's like doing two things at once here. Okay. In any event, I don't expect you to look at the top of the slide, but what we've done is we've said, if there's a general increase in SQFs throughout the borough, outside the precinct of interest, a street in the week it occurs, etc., a street segment in the precinct of interest is also likely to have an increase. So what we're getting is a sort of policy. There's a policy generally out here, and it's affecting individual street segments. It's a policy outside that area where the street segment occurs, in the larger large areas away from the street segment. So, I think it's a plausible instrument. I expect to hear some implausibility arguments as we go on. Instruments are tough. The instrument does what it's supposed to do, which, if you noted Rick's slides, when he tried to take into account the endogeneity problem, the positive correlation between crime and SQFs that exist and exist in these data as well becomes negative. Same thing happens here. So, we believe for all sorts of reasons there's a reasonable instrument, but plausibility becomes an issue. Okay, so the first line is really the important one. In 4 of the 5 boroughs, this was also pretty time-intensive in some cases. 4 of the 5 boroughs, we end up with a significant deterrent effect. That effect varies between about 0.3% to about to over 1%. Did I say 0.3%? That's a 0.13. Shouldn't that be? It is 0.13. Excuse me. From about 6% to, well, it's actually 3% to about 1%, meaning that an SQF an additional SQF last week has an effect of changing the probability of a crime, reducing it anywhere from about 0.3% to about 1%. So, yeah, I interpreted that wrong. God. Okay, looking at the slides from here. The interpretation should be, it's on the next slide, I'm sorry, from about 0.7% to a decline of 3%. A 1%, an increase in SQF the week before has a deterrent effect of about 0.7% to 3%. I don't know when I'm looking over there, my eyesight's not so good. Anyway, so what does this suggest? The findings have a significant deterrent effect on crime at a microgeographic level. They kind of follow what we found before. In terms of the effect size, well, is it large or small? This is an issue that Rick raised before. Well, I don't know about that. I'm going to talk about cost-benefit in a few minutes, but in any event, it's significant. It seems to be meaningful. Each SQF, if they're not a very expensive tactic for a minute, I'll talk about that in a minute, can lead to a decline, at least in 4 of the 5 boroughs, of between almost 1% to about 3%. Okay. What do these data tell us? So SQFs appear to deter the occurrence of a crime at a microgeographic level. The descriptive trends we showed are pretty consistent with the analytic approach we chose. In other words, the story seems to be fairly consistent. It's actually consistent also with the story presented earlier at a slightly larger level. I want to emphasize again, this doesn't prove that SQFs deter crime, but it provides evidence which supports an assumption of short-term deterrent effects. Again, just to say it, I hate to do it all the time, our work is observational, not experimental. It's difficult to establish causality and rule out other potential causes of change. But I think what's important here as well is there's a pretty good theory here that this is what should happen. In other words, we have a lot of prior literature, a lot of work, not on SQFs in crime, but on hotspots policing in crime. And that suggests hotspots policing has a deterrent effect, and this is consistent with that. Now, Rick raised this as well. He said, well, are these findings consistent with recent data? Because the New York Times at least suggests, and Rick spoke about it, the declines in the last year did not, in SQF, did not seem to lead to a crime wave in the city or anything like that. And you might ask, well, how are our findings consistent? Well, first of all, SQF might have declined, but other hotspots policing strategies or other strategies they're using may have actually increased during the period. In other words, you'd have to assume that there's a deep policing. I'm not going to assume, I don't know if you can assume in a city like New York that there's been deep policing. You might assume the police have been doing different things. If they've been doing different things, maybe those different things are effective and they should have been doing them in the first place rather than SQFs, perhaps. But nonetheless, it's hard to draw a very strong conclusion. It's also the case that there could be all sorts of other things going on in New York City during this period. There's uptake in the economy, there's an election, there's all kinds of things. So the fact that in the last year, there doesn't seem to be an SQF relationship descriptively between SQFs and crime should be taken with caution. It doesn't prove anything, much as the descriptive data we talked about earlier. Now, of course, there's something else here. I called it a few times the elephant in the room, and that's the long-term impacts of declining police legitimacy. So let's take the following model. That over time, SQF's been used by New York year after year after year, 800,000, 600,000, 500,000 in certain neighborhoods, because these are being concentrated hotspots. Where are those hotspots? They tend to be in certain minority neighborhoods, quite often, not all the time. And in that situation, you might expect over the long term a sort of decline in perceptions of legitimacy and trust in the police if people are right about what their view is of the effects of SQFs. And if that's happening, maybe SQFs over time lost some degree of their effect. That would be an interesting thing to model. Does SQFs early in the period have a deterrent effect, and does it lose that deterrent effect over time? Now, I guess the question everybody wants to ask is, are SQFs cost effective? And that is a really hard question to answer. And it depends what you mean by a cost. I mean, economists tend to think of cost in economic terms, but sociologists, for example, think of cost in many different ways in terms of other social factors. To estimate the cost effectiveness, we'd have to know, first of all, how much an SQF costs. Now, I think we can assume that SQFs are not very expensive. If you can run 800,000 of them in a year while you're doing everything else, and we have a declining size of a police force, which was what's happening in New York during that period, well, we can say there's not really an expensive strategy. However, saying it's not expensive in that regard doesn't mean it's not expensive in other ways. There might be a large cost in terms of police legitimacy. And let me tell you how that cost could work in two ways. First, if there's a theory out there, I don't think it's a proven theory, if you like, but there's evidence out there that police legitimacy affects crime control, what I mentioned earlier. So if police legitimacy lowers, you might expect crime control gains to also lower. Well, there's a theory about that. There's not a lot of experimental evidence. Tom Tyler and I both believe that New York City would be a great place to look at this issue in terms of, let's call it intensive policing, but intensive policing with high legitimacy. But one issue is that you could, this could be a cost in terms of the crime prevention gains. But even if it has no crime prevention impact, it's still a really important issue. One of the important outcomes for policing is the trust of the public. One of the really important outcomes of policing is legitimacy evaluations of the public. I think there's very, very few people today that would disagree with that. So even if this had no crime prevention implications, a high cost on legitimacy would be a very important thing to enter into the model. Now, what about cost effectiveness? It also would depend on the circumstances. Well, let's take the following assumption. The cost of SQFs are low. Well, I think that's probably right. This is This doesn't take a brilliance, a lot of, you send people out there. That's what they would, in Project Impact in New York, you sent lots of people out there to these places, and you said, do stop, question, frisk, or at least do intensive policing at those places. Let me just say an aside. It's not very costly in that sense, but one thing interesting about New York as well that Bill Bratton has already talked about is if you were going to send lots of people out to do stop, question, frisk, why would you send the most inexperienced people in the police department to do one of the most difficult citizen-police interactions? I mean, Bill Bratton has caught up to that already. But anyway, so let's say for a minute that the cost of SQFs are low. And let's say that you could do it with little negative legitimacy outcomes. So what I would argue from the data we have here is that at crime hotspots where there are a large number of SQFs, in other words, where you have a lot of crime and you can bring a lot of SQFs, I think you can probably deter large numbers of crimes. If you factor those estimates we talked about earlier up, and you said, well, you could have a 3% change and you could bring for each SQF, and now you can bring 10 SQFs or 20% SQFs, you could get pretty large effects. But I would say that would probably only be useful if you've got a place with lots of crime you're trying to deter. Going to a street that has one crime every century, I don't think you're going to have much deterrent value. And it's also important, though we don't look at this, and this is something Rick did, in cutting up our data the way we do, it's hard to look at this kind of thing. There's not a lot of data at the weekly level, certainly not at the daily level. But if you have streets with very serious crimes, in other words, there aren't all that many crimes. Maybe it doesn't have 300 or 400 in a year. Maybe it has 50. But at the same time, those 50s are all robberies, which is a pretty serious crime in terms of its impact on the public. Well, if you have a geography in which there's concentrations of serious crimes, and you can reduce their probability by bringing 20 or 30 or 50 SQFs, then you can have a big effect. If you were arranging those strategies, taking space and time into account. Just generally studying these strategies seems to me insane. What you want to do here is see when you have heightened activity in space and time, and then try to break that space-time interaction. Of course, as I said before, the elephant in the room of all this nice thought about how cost-effective this could be is the problem of legitimacy, which I think is gigantic here. Now, can we achieve equal deterrence without the cost of lowered legitimacy? Now, these data, and data more generally on geographically focused policing, suggests that the police can deter crime by focusing in on microgeographic crime concentration on hotspots. I don't think I'm an advocate of this work. I think I've been very skeptical of it. If you look at my career, I've ran experiments to look at it. I did a study on displacement when all the evidence was there was no displacement. I said the studies aren't good enough. So I'm challenging this. But I think after all those challenges, it seems to be that hotspots policing or microgeographically focused crime prevention can be an effective approach to doing something about crime. And SQFs do focus on crime hotspots. So it's not surprising to me that all the analyses we're doing show some kind of deterrent effect. How large, how small. Remember when we figure out how large, how small here, the noise in these analyses are like gigantic, just gigantic. The things we don't know, the way in which these things are interacting over time create a lot of noise. But even if we were to assume that the effects were the size of effects you'd get in a problem-oriented policing program or anything else, even if we assume all that, okay, but the question becomes, well, could we get those same effects with a strategy that's much less negative, that has much less noxious consequences? And I think that's really the key question that New York should be thinking about at the moment. Yeah, if you've ever walked the streets with cops, when you stop someone and you tell them, you order them, remember, this is not a consensual stop. In the West Coast, they use consensual Terry stops. In the East Coast, they're non-consensual for the most part. It's not consensual. You walk up to somebody, probably someone, in your mind you have reasonable suspicion. Maybe the person's young, it's a drug hotspot. Think of all the ways in which you can gain for yourself reasonable suspicion. In the data that the New York City produces, there's a code on, what is this, a crime hotspot or a drug hotspot? So every 18-year-old kid may be hanging around a drug hotspot. In this mind, there's some reasonable cause. Whether that's constitutional or not, I suspect not. But nonetheless, that would be the mentality you might use. So you come up and you stop the person and you tell them you're now going to physically search them. When I first started going through the searches at airports, it used to make me very angry. I live in Israel where we get searched all the time. And I have to say, no matter how many times I go into the university, when that guy stops me and starts giving me trouble, I get angry. I don't like it. I feel like saying, what are you searching me for? I'm not like, especially now with the gray hair and being older and all that kind of stuff, I don't fit that profile. But anyway, the point is that these have very important impacts on that microgeographic level. In other words, I would ask you to think not only about crime and the issues I'm raising, but the effects at a microgeographic level. Now, let's say you did some similar things. In other words, let's say you came to that hotspot, and hotspots of crime in New York can have 400 crimes in a year. There's probably a hell of a lot of other stuff going on, many more calls, right? You get to that hotspot, and it's a Sunday or Saturday, and there's a lot of activity, and the cop goes in the block, and he walks up to the guy and says, my name is Officer So-and-so. Here's my card. I want you to know that I'm going to be around here a lot. If you need help, I can help you. I really want to make this place a better place and make your life better. I mean, think of the way you would do this. And then the cop turned around and said, now tell me your story, right? Now, let me tell you something. In New York City, we have very sophisticated young people. The person can turn around and say, excuse the expression, F you. I don't have to talk to you, and I know that, right? You're not stopping, questioning, frisk everyone, so it's true. You do not have to respond to a police request or discussion. You do not have to call the police. You do not have to have identification. Those are constitutional rights in the United States, right? You don't have to have any of those things. But the point is that kid knowing you're on the block, that, if you ask me, is a lot of the effect of hotspots policing. Now, I've been thinking about this for a while, in part based on Tom Toller's work, and I'm glad that Tom is very interested in this idea with me. Also Tracy Miras and Anthony Braga. What we're thinking about is a new generation of hotspot studies. Ones that would be intensive, focused on crime control, but at the same time would involve training police in the art of legitimacy, if you call it that. Training police on the kinds of things they should be doing, the kinds of things they shouldn't be doing, and how to do things in a way to lower the sense of lack of trust and illegitimacy of the police. For example, in Tom's work, he's found that merely giving a person, when you arrest them, give a person a chance to tell about their side of the story and to write it down and show you're paying attention has a gigantic effect on the way the person feels after that incident, about the incident. So these are all things I think can be done. So I guess I'd like to see New York City become the leader and not a follower, as Rick has spoken about. When I published my first paper, I was very popular with the mayor's office in New York. I couldn't come here because I was out of the country, but I was very popular for a short period until they heard me talk about SQFs. In other words, I was popular because they thought that my work would show that SQFs is not just spread across the city, but highly concentrated at hotspots, reinforced what they were trying to say, their story. And I guess it does in one level. They were trying to say, we're not just arresting people all over the place. We're going to places that have a lot of crime, and that's where we're focusing our efforts. And that part of the story, I think, is a right one. It doesn't mean they don't make lone arrests all over the place, but overall, that story is a right one. But the other side of the story is this. We can't know from these analyses that SQFs deter crime, but it's sure consistent with other analyses that have looked at the effects of policing that is very geographically focused. Now the question becomes, how can New York City take advantage of all that in a way that thinks also about legitimacy and the issues related to trust in the police? That would be an amazing, amazing change. And one, if the New York City Police Department carried out thinking in experimental terms, in ways they could evaluate and establish causality, that would make New York known not for being the city that had 800,000 stop, question, frisks in a year, but as the city who thought about how to carry out intensive crime prevention policing in a way that maximizes legitimacy, evaluations of legitimacy of the police. Thank you.
So first we're going to have Bob Apel speak to us. He's an associate professor at Rutgers University, and he specializes on the relationship between employment and crime, as well as between incarceration experiences and life outcomes. After that, Tanya Koch, who recently joined the faculty at John Jay, we're delighted to have her here, is going to be speaking to us. She's an attorney and a former public defender, so I think she'll give us a unique insight into this experience. She also worked with several different agencies, including the American Civil Liberties Union, the Brennan Center for Justice, and the NAAC Legal Defense Fund. Dolores Jones-Brown will speak to us after that, and she's a professor of the Department of Law, Police Science, and Criminal Justice at John Jay, and she's also the founding director for the Center for Race, Crime, and Justice. And she you guys may have read her primer, which is on Stop, Question, and Frisk, where she had the initial one come out in 2011, and then I think you had a follow-up in just last year.
2010 and 2013.
2010 and 2013, and it really focuses on the race and ethnic disparities in Stop, Question, and Frisk. Dolores Jones-Brown will be followed by Dr. Steve Mesner, who is a distinguished teacher professor at SUNY Albany, and he studies both spatial and temporal patterns of crime. And then Dr. Tom Tyler will be speaking to us. He's a professor of law and psychology at Yale University, and David referred a lot to his work, but he's an expert in terms of police legitimacy and procedural justice. So we're very lucky to have a very distinguished panel here, and I will leave it up to you guys. Go ahead. Yeah, you will start with Bob, and then
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much. You know, this morning I was joking with Tom Tyler, who I'm sitting at the table with, that I was going to only talk about legitimacy, and that way whenever Tom got up to talk, he would have to say, as Bob has mentioned. It would make me sound really smart. Actually, I won't have anything to say about legitimacy, but my comments are going to be focused on three things. First, providing some theoretical context for Stop, Question, and Frisk, elaborating on some of the empirical challenges and estimating its impact on crime, and then outlining some suggestions for further consideration. It helps first to step back a little bit and consider the theoretical rationale of Stop, Question, and Frisk. The tactic is rooted in deterrence. This is an implicit theory of choice in which would-be offenders weigh the potential rewards of crime against the potential losses. Now, crime is said to be deterred when at least one of three sanction characteristics lowers the expected advantages from crime relative to the expected advantages from non-criminal courses of action. These characteristics, as any criminologist would be able to tell you, include certainty or the probability of detection, severity or the intensity of punishment, and celerity or the swiftness of disposition. Now, Stop, Question, and Frisk obviously operates largely on certainty enhancement. So the logic is that by performing aggressive field interrogations in high-crime neighborhoods, police officers signal to potential criminals that the risk of detection is too great. One byproduct is a potential removal of handguns, whose instrumentality can transform otherwise non-lethal disputes into lethal ones. So a deterrent impact of Stop, Question, and Frisk on crime is at least theoretically plausible. So let's consider other facts about criminal justice in New York City that will be helpful for putting Stop, Question, and Frisk into contemporary context. There are two countervailing trends that make the sustained crime reductions in New York City remarkable. First, there's now a well-established body of research indicating that hiring more police officers has a deterrent impact on serious crime. For example, the consensus estimate is that a 10% increase in sworn personnel yields a reduction in total crime in the neighborhood of 3%. With reductions in violent crime ranging from 5 to 10%. Second, while estimates vary widely and are subject to diminishing returns, there is some reason to believe that sending more convicted offenders to prison maybe has a modest deterrent impact on crime. Now, these findings on police and prisons are important because New York City has been quietly downsizing in both areas for the last 10 years. Police staffing is down from about 40,000 to 35,000, representing around a 15% per capita decline from its peak in the early 2000s. By that estimate, serious crime should be about 3 to 5% higher today than it was 10 years ago. Instead, crime during the same interval is actually down by about 1/3. Furthermore, the New York State prison population has declined by around 20%. Much of this driven by a drop in new commitments for drug offenses committed in New York City. So all this suggests that growth in stop, question, and frisk, among other changes in police behavior, might have helped make up for the shortfall created by criminal justice budget cuts. The question before us today is whether stop, question, and frisk is indeed causally related to the sustained low levels of crime. So now I'll turn my attention to some empirical aspects of these two studies. Now, first, I'd like to credit both of them for the close attention that they devote to what I call the counterfactual problem. So for non-researchers in the room, when we ask questions about the causal impact of stop, question, and frisk on crime, we are inherently asking about what would have happened to crime in a neighborhood had it not experienced stop, question, and frisk at the level that it actually experienced. The challenge, as we've already seen, is that SQF is used strategically in the sense that it tends to be applied most heavily in those areas characterized by the worst crime problems. Now, the implication is that to some degree, neighborhoods choose themselves for the number of stop, question, and frisks that they experience. Now, to a researcher, this is the basis of what's called the selection problem. The empirical challenge is to devise compelling ways to overcome this problem. Now, without having a paper to read the methods more closely, I think that both of these studies have done everything that they could about the selection problem with the data that they had at their disposal. In fact, both studies employed multiple methods and sensitivity analyses to evaluate how robust their findings are. Now, as I move forward, I'd actually like to raise some additional issues that I would like for them to devote careful consideration to, as they concern how to interpret the apparent deterrent effect of stop, question, and frisk on crime. First and foremost, stop, question, and frisks are performed as part of a broader enforcement regime, and unfortunately, we don't have any information about other elements of the regime. So questions about the causal impact of stop, question, and frisk on crime are questions about what is known as marginal deterrence. So that is, we are interested in knowing the unique impact of incremental increases in stop, question, and frisk on crime over and above the other ongoing law enforcement activities. Something that we really need to know is what else the police were doing in the neighborhoods where they were the most aggressive with their use of the stop, question, and frisk tactic. For example, it would be helpful to have information about other measures of police productivity, namely the number of arrests and tickets that did not result from stop, question, and frisks, as well as tickets for moving violations, as well as the length of time they spend in crime hotspots, and so on and so forth. So it's important to remember that growth in stop, question, and frisk does not occur in isolation from growth in other forms of police visibility and activity. So indeed, if the number of stop, question, and frisks in a neighborhood were to drop to zero, the neighborhood would be hardly free of police scrutiny. So secondly, stop, question, and frisk and other enforcement tools are not independent of passive activities. For example, surveillance has expanded markedly during the time period under consideration in these two studies. The New York City Housing Authority has spent millions of dollars installing security cameras and reportedly installed 3,500 cameras between 2003 and 2012, the time period during which these studies are being conducted. So the point of all this is to urge very careful consideration of other enforcement and surveillance activities that are likely to confound the deterrent effect of stop, question, and frisk on crime. Now, data needs aside, I'd like to make one final observation about the apparent efficacy of stop, question, and frisk with respect to crime, or at least certain kinds of crime. And let's assume that it does lower crime rates. Now, who is changing their behavior? Potential offenders or potential victims? So one argument is that potential offenders curtail their activity for fear of being stopped by police. This is the deterrence argument. However, I wonder to what degree some of these findings are due to changes in the behavior of potential victims. In light of survey evidence from Vera Institute and plenty of anecdotal evidence, there's an argument to be made that potential crime victims are reluctant to be out and about in these neighborhoods for fear of being harassed by police for doing nothing wrong. So this means that some crime reduction could actually be attributable to opportunity reduction rather than strictly deterrence. So I would argue that we want to bear this in mind as both victims and offenders are likely to be responding to stop, question, and frisk practices. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and to be a discussant, and I responded to some of this very interesting and important research that David and Rick have presented today. I wanted to talk about two things that especially struck me about the research presented this morning and just now by David Weisburd and Rick Rosenfeld and their colleagues. The first is really the outsized role that Stop, Question, and Frisk plays at intersections in the policing of minority neighborhoods. And David, I saw this in the set of slides that you sent us a few days ago. I'm not sure if it was in the presentation today, but one of your observations from the research was that although crime is a highly concentrated phenomenon, specific to people in physical places, i.e. a small number of offenders are responsible for a majority of crime, and that crime tends to be concentrated in a relatively limited number of hotspots. What I found so interesting about your research was that although a majority of Stop, Question, and Frisk occurs at intersections, it's not necessarily the case that a majority of crime is occurring there. Do I have that right? And your research suggested that about 5% of the intersections in your study have over 50% of the crime that occurs on street corners. But how do you then reconcile that with the finding that most crime occurs not on street corners but elsewhere on street segments and in these neighborhoods? And moreover, that most of these crimes at intersections are, according to David's research, traffic related, i.e., they're presumably crimes of happenstance rather than crimes of premeditation, and thus one would think immune from the deterrent effects of a police stop and frisk. And I asked myself, in an era of CompStat policing and GIS, sophisticated GIS technology, where incidents of crime can be mapped with precision to a door frame, why should street corners in minority neighborhoods attract such inordinate attention from police? And my guess, and here this is, some armchair psychology on my part, but my guess is that the corner is not just a physical locus of potential crime, but is also a powerful metaphor for criminality. The corner conjures, in the popular imagination, a season's worth of images from The Wire, all of them heavily raced, right? It's shorthand for an illicit way of life, that is drug dealing. It's shorthand for an illicit way of being, that is idle, cocky, and unemployed, and for gender, race, and place. That is men of color, either young ones or drunk ones, in poor neighborhoods. And of course, there's been a long line of sociologists from Elliot Liebau, who wrote a seminal book in 1967 called Tally's Corner, to Sudhir Venkatesh's study of drug dealers who live with their moms, a long history of sociologists studying men on urban street corners to explain, dismiss, or affirm theories of black pathology. Why are they there doing nothing in the middle of the day? What keeps them from marrying the mothers of their children and helping to raise their kids? Now, when I was a younger girl, a teenager in the 1980s, we called these street corner guys B-boys. We didn't pay much attention to the older ones, but the younger ones, they had their Kangol cats on and their hats on and their velour tracksuits, and they'd turn down their Radio Raheem boom boxes as the pretty girls walked by. My friends and I, we considered them mostly a harmless nuisance, but it really wasn't until the crack boom of the 1980s that I think the urban street corner became deeply, deeply associated with drug dealing, and then following the economic shocks of globalization with hardcore unemployment. And so while much of the criminal justice literature today treats unemployment as a collateral consequence of criminal arrest and conviction, I would observe that the dim and frankly declining employment prospects of men of color in New York City are also a causal factor that has helped to sustain support in some quarters for aggressive stop and frisk policing in low-income neighborhoods. And I think one of the social fissures here that stop and frisk responds to is a transformed economy that has consigned working class whites to, service economy subsistence jobs at Home Depot, and the urban poor, in particular black men, to the slag heap, to the labor market slag heap. In New York City, the employment rate for black men has stayed pretty stubbornly at around 50%, despite a brightening economic picture for African Americans in other parts of the country. And so even if it's a highly inefficient means of crime control, requiring, according to Rick's research, 500 to 800 stops to catch a single offender, stop, question, and frisk, I think, like mass incarceration, as my colleague and friend Michelle Alexander argues so powerfully in her book, The New Jim Crow, I think acquits itself quite well in the larger social enterprise of mediating deep-seated racial anxieties about large numbers of idle black men, disaffected, unemployed, with nothing to lose, and the threat of disorder and riot that they provoke and evoke in the popular imagination. So in this fashion, I think we have to consider that stop, question, and frisk operates as more than a crime control strategy. It's also functioning as an important means of social control over a population of residents who are now largely marginal to the modern economy. And I think it's just highly unlikely that we would be locking up so much human capital, or at least so willingly undermining so many young people's employment prospects with petty arrests or manufactured arrests, as in the case of, empty your pockets, plain view marijuana arrests, if there were a place and a real demand for these particular young people in the economy. And so, as Dr. Rosenfeld and Weisburd have pointed out, it indeed would be very nice if the NYPD would deploy or reform stop and frisk in control group experimental fashion, right? And do so in white and Hispanic and black neighborhoods so that the effects of stop and frisk on crime could be more accurately measured. But this, of course, would be a politically costly strategy, and I would argue so costly as to be infeasible. While there's undoubtedly as much pot smoking and dealing going on among 20-something tech entrepreneurs in Manhattan as prevails on the streets of central Brooklyn, I think it would be unthinkable for the NYPD to stop and frisk them as they emerge from their loft offices in Silicon Alley, as we so regularly do Black and Latino youth on their way home from school. Now, of course, this is not the first time in our history that we've resorted to criminal justice control, or at least employed the criminal justice system as a means of social control during times of economic upheaval, or at least upheaval in the economic order of things. As students of history know, the criminal justice system was a principal means of curtailing the political and economic empowerment of former slaves following emancipation. Vagrancy laws allowed sheriffs to arrest any black person who couldn't produce written proof of employment. Convict leasing laws allowed county governments to lease prisoners back to plantation owners and railroad operators in a refashioned system of slavery. In her book, The Great Migration, which some of you may have read, Isabel Wilkerson describes how some 50 years after the end of slavery, Southern sheriffs regularly patrolled local train stations in Southern communities at night on the lookout for black sharecroppers who were sneaking off to a better life up north. Of course, this kind of, the racial social control that I'm suggesting is present today is different in an important respect in that in 150 years ago, the economy vitally depended on black labor to pick their crops, to operate their steel mills and their factories. Back then, the criminal justice system was being deployed in the service of recapturing plantation labor lost to emancipation and later to the labor demands of an industrializing North. Today, by contrast, the descendants of those very workers are marginal actors in a refashioned economy that relies on immigrants for very low-wage work, and of course those with college degrees for higher order jobs requiring technical skill. So I would suggest that stop and frisk and the criminal justice system as a larger enterprise is enlisted not so much to impress any more black and brown people into the workforce, but instead to suppress, constrain, and ultimately warehouse many of them, many of that surplus labor that's hanging out on the street corner. I'd also was really thinking about how police respond to and interact with people on the corner, particularly young men. And this reminds me very much of David's point just now that we have to rethink interactions, right, between police and I would say in particular young people on the street. Because I think the corner is not just a place that sometimes produces crime or maybe, often produces crime, but it's a place where we expect to find crime, right? Because idle males tend to congregate there. And these aren't just any idle men, these are idle black men, for the most part, that are subject to stop and frisk, with all of their alpha male signifying power of aggression, criminality, and cool. Those of you who've been following the neuroscience of implicit bias know that emerging science is helping us to measure the persistence and the power of negative racial associations. But I want to suggest that the aura of hypermasculinity on those street corners is one that evokes challenge and envy as well as fear and loathing, right? And that for, I think, many young police officers, many of them white, right? Foreigners to the ghetto, so to speak, that aura of hypermasculinity is a compelling mix, right, for young officers who are looking to prove themselves or make their 5150 numbers, right? And so the street corner, I think, is both a locus of illicit activity in urban folklore, as well as a site and a venue of male contestation. Those intersections tend to demarcate the territory of one drug dealer from another, one gang turf from another. And there's some recent research by my colleague, Phil Goff, who serves with me on a task force that we created at the Atlantic Philanthropies on school discipline and race disparities. And his research suggests that the role of masculinity threat among police officers is actually a predictive factor in whether they use more severe levels of force against black suspects. And of course, we know that battles for dominance and control of the corner extend to police as well as to pimps. The second point, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll just mention this quickly and maybe I can discuss it a little bit more later, but the second point that I'd make about this very interesting research we've heard today is that, and it's really less an observation than a challenge to researchers and policymakers. And that is, I think, that in addition to inquiring whether stop and frisk reduces crime, I think we really need more investigation into whether this style of aggressive policing itself contributes to crime. By reinforcing the negative self-image of young people and undermining their ability to envision a productive future for themselves. In a recent study published in Crime and Delinquency, Stephanie Wiley of the University of Missouri at St. Louis followed some 2,600 young people in 7 cities who were enrolled in a gang prevention program. And what she found is that those who were stopped by police during the study period reported 5 more delinquent acts than those who were not, even after controlling for race, age, delinquent history, and so forth. The essence of her finding, as she describes it, is that police contact had not only an effect on offending, but also an impact on attitudes and other measures of these young people. Those who were stopped were less likely to report that they would feel guilty if they were to commit future offenses as a result of the stop. And of course, this line of inquiry connects very fundamentally to an emerging body of research in the education field that really is exploring the role that student optimism and perseverance, what researchers call grit, play in educational success. And it seems that student grit, the ability to envision oneself in a better future, to set goals and to persevere towards them, may be just as important as innate ability or poverty or other socioeconomic factors to graduating on time and succeeding in college. And so, leads me to ask if the antithesis of optimism is a lack of hope. What are the implications for this research, right? For young men who are consistently and repeatedly thrown up against the wall and said, let me search your backpack, right? That kind of presumption of criminality. I recently met a young man from Brownsville, Brooklyn, who was featured in a film on structural racism and its role in the United States. And there were all of these, trainers from Undoing Racism who were talking about race plus privilege equals power, and that's what structural racism is, and the students' eyes were glazing over. And then at the end of this movie, this young man from Brownsville describes an incident in which he was coming home from school, passing through Fort Greene Park, and he's stopped by an officer who says, let me search your backpack. And the officer pulls out a Sharpie marker and then arrests him for possession of graffiti materials, which in New York City is a B misdemeanor. And, I met this young man after the screening of the film. I said, so what happened to your case? And he said, well, it took me 2 trips to court with my parents. I missed 2 days of school. My parents missed 2 days of school before I had a chance to explain to the judge that I attend an arts and technical high school. And so, of course, I have Sharpie markers. And indeed, would any white child ever be asked to justify why he has a Sharpie marker in his backpack? And so I just want to suggest that I think those sorts of practices, in which we are sort of looking to prove that these young people are up to no good is deeply, deeply discouraging, right? And disempowering to their own sense of self and their ability to finish school, right? To see themselves in a place other than prison. So I just would end by saying that I think we have to consider deterrence in 2 dimensions. Not just, although this is a hugely important question, not just to stop, question, and frisk, what is its impact on deterring crime, but what is the impact of practices like stop, question, and frisk that depend on surveillance and assumptions of criminality? What is its impact in deterring young people from persisting, right? And getting employment, seeking employment, going to college. We know that the dropout rate is a key predictor of crime and incarceration. So I think we have to begin to connect the dots, right, between our criminal justice practices, our educational future of our children, and what we say we aspire for them. So anyway, this is some of the research that I hope to do at John Jay in the next couple of years, and I so appreciate your time and attention today. Thank you for having me.
I want to start off by saying this is unfair. It's unfair that I have to follow Tanya, and it's unfair that you have to listen to us back to back. Much of what I will say has been said by the researchers, the presenters, the discussants thus far, but I think it's important enough that it bears repeating, and that perhaps when we leave the room, we will remember the things that have been said, in addition to the magnificent, if this were a colorblind world, great statistical research that we've heard about today. So I want to start with the notion that the elephant in the room is not police legitimacy. It centers around 3 fundamental needs, imperatives, or concern. The first is the need to recognize and respect the personal rights of law-abiding people who make up the majority of residents in low-income, high-crime areas. The second is the need to recognize and respect the legal limits of police authority. And the third is the need to recognize and respect the limits of social science research. Now, need number one I want to call SQF and the individual right to liberty. A long line of empirical research has established that even in high crime areas, the majority of serious crime is committed by a relatively small number of active repeat offenders. And there's some criminologists in the room who could be cited for that proposition. Aggressive stop and frisk in New York City has not been limited to finite hotspots. At least that's my position, and I didn't hear Professor Weisburd sort of define hotspots, and I think it's an area of contention on how big or how small a hotspot is, so I love the fact that this research focuses on corners. But stop and frisk in New York City has been utilized across entire neighborhoods to suspect people that nearly 90% of the time are found to be innocent of wrongdoing, or to take into consideration that the police can't always be right. They're not found to be guilty of wrongdoing. I was struck by Professor Weisburd's finding that stop and frisk was more tightly clustered than crime in his Bronx example, but I'd like to hear more about that in the discussion later on. So for Black and Latino young men, their inaccurate characterization as dangerous or criminal occurs repeatedly, at times more than once in a single day. The remaining 10% of the time in which crime, and I put that in quotation marks, is found, roughly half of the time, the offense discovered is misdemeanor marijuana possession. And so we must ask ourselves the question, is this the kind of a crime SQS was designed to interdict? Is this the kind of crime SQF was designed to interdict? For innocent residents who are repeatedly stopped by police or who live in fear of being stopped, not because they are contemplating criminal conduct, but because of the unpredictability of how any given officer will behave during such a stop, or the embarrassment of being seen by neighbors and onlookers when they have done nothing wrong.
So that means I'm going to start it. I'm going to start it on these two. Okay. That means I need one here, and maybe one.
And most importantly, the feeling of not being able to move about the public streets as freely as their white or wealthier counterparts, are all costs of SQS policing not measured and possibly...
Check, 1, 2.
See, since I am a conspiracy theorist, I'm convinced it's a setup, right? So I'm going to repeat that last part. So, and most importantly, the feeling of not being able to move about the public streets as freely as their white or wealthier counterparts are all costs of SQS policing not measured and possibly not fully measurable by the research presented today. But research by Stout, Fine, and Fox, the Vera Institute, and others suggests that the costs include lost wages and legal fees when these unwarranted stops go bad, when residents express their indignity at having been stopped. The research also shows significant psychological effects on youth, and mentioned earlier the Wiley and Espenson research suggests that these youth who repeatedly experience stops may actually engage in increased delinquency. There's also a recent report by the Attorney General's office that was conducted and looks at the costs associated with the unwarranted use of court resources for these kinds of unwarranted stops and what flows from it. The Attorney General's report also talks about the cost of civil litigation that comes out of the experience of an unwarranted stop. And then finally, there's the dark figure of unreported and unresolved crime because citizens do not trust or cooperate with police
to disclose actual rather than suspected crimes, including serious ones. Now, need number 2, I call policing and the law. The use of stop and frisk, I'm going to shorten it, as a crime control strategy is too often discussed devoid of the legal framework that authorizes its use. The idea that police operate to enforce the law too often focuses on enforcement of penal law in absence of their obligation to operate within the limits of constitutional, procedural, and civil law. The expansion of the Terry versus Ohio decision to include policing for deterrence of crime, and I'm going to repeat this 2 times, and I defy anyone to read the opinion and tell me that I am wrong. Those conspiracy people, right? The expansion of the Terry versus Ohio decision to include policing for deterrence of crime is not expressly authorized by the opinion. The opinion is about detecting crime, including attempts to commit a crime on less than probable cause. The NYPD's own statistics indicate that its officers do a terrible job of this, and that is detecting crime using stop and frisk. Given that based on directly measurable standards, officers are inaccurate in their suspicion of crime, nearly, this is a quiz for the audience, how often are officers inaccurate in their suspicion of crime based on the available statistics from the NYPD? Inaccurate, they're inaccurate nearly 90% of the time, inaccurate. When it comes to weapons carrying, the original legal authorization under Terry, officers are inaccurate nearly 99% of the time. So statistical analyses that include offenses other than potentially dangerous weapons-related behavior and that fail to focus on the accuracy of detection as at least one of the measures of the value of stop and frisk as a policing strategy, ignore the significance of legal restraints Okay. Yeah, I see people are like watching them, right? Okay. So statistical analyses that include offenses other than potentially dangerous weapons-related behavior and that fail to focus on the accuracy of detection as a measure of the value of stop and frisk as a policing strategy, ignore the significance of legal constraints on police behavior, and impermissibly expand police legal authority, and impermissibly direct police to look at residents in the aggregate rather than as individuals with personal character and individualized rights. Need number 3, I call statistical measures versus the law. Okay? So the first limit on our statistical analyses is that we cannot control for data manipulation before it reaches academic researchers. So as the researchers have talked about, they're stuck with the data with which they're given, and so the question came up earlier whether crime decline in the city might be produced by something other than stop and frisk, since it has been so significant? And the answer is yes. There are a number of publications out there that talk about, not just in New York City, but data manipulation, the downgrading of offenses and behavior for the purpose of making crime appear to be lower, again, not just in New York City. So both research papers that we heard today acknowledged the researchers' inability to control for all variables that might affect crime in New York City, whether we're looking at entire precincts, neighborhoods, or micro-level geocoded intersections. In fact, I think that Weisburd et al.'s slide number 20 says this best. The slide, as you will recall, says the limitations of the spatio-temporal approach does not control for other SQFs or confounding factors that occur within the space and time lags, which may affect the likelihood of a crime event. For example, other policing techniques that were operating simultaneously with stop and frisk could be more responsible for the decline than stop and frisk is. Also, we had 2 conferences here at John Jay that talked about community-based involvement with anti-crime activities. So we know that at the community level, the individuals who live within various communities that are called high crime are themselves engaged in activity to produce public safety in their personal setting. So despite the original strong admission about the limitations of this kind of research, in summation, Weisburd et al., they make a clear pronouncement of causation that contradicts the rightful uncertainty expressed in the earlier slide, though I can say I heard Professor Weisburd back away from that in his extended discussion of the research. But on the slide that was marked summary, it says the findings suggest that SQFs with an S have a significant deterrent effect on crime at a microgeographic level. And so for my purposes, there's a bit of a contradiction between the 2 sets of slides. The notion is that no matter how much one is invested in a particular intuitive belief, i.e., that stop and frisk deters crime, correlation does not become causation in an equation or set of equations that fail to take a multitude of known and unknown variables into account. And if it were possible to somehow create a definitive model that could parse out all known variables and show numerically that only a small portion of crime correlates remain unexplained, again, numerically, is social science the appropriate moral, ethical, or legal arbiter of the degree of personal liberty to which one is entitled? I think that's an important question for us to consider. Crime declined substantially in cities that did not report high levels of aggressive stop and frisk. Might, as Rosenfeld noted earlier, the increased police presence alone have been sufficient to contribute to decreased crime? What proof is there that the interference with the personal liberty of hundreds of thousands of innocent people contributed in any significant way to crime levels in a location beyond that which would have occurred if the police patrolled that location and kept their hands to themselves? So a couple of final noteworthy pieces of research that exist in the city. Racial and ethnic minorities are disproportionately stopped in low crime areas and in areas where they are not the majority of residents. One study found that racial and ethnic minorities may make up 70% of those stopped in areas where they make up between 11 and 14% of residents. The current research does not address these phenomena nor their implications for crime.
It's also a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to participate in the symposium. I was really quite impressed with both of the presentations. I think they do go beyond prior research in significant ways, quite sophisticated. The high level of sophistication poses something of a challenge for a discussant. A lot of issues have been anticipated. It also doesn't help to be a little late in the queue of discussants. We've had some very important points raised already. So I'll be very modest in my objectives. And to some extent, it follows from the previous paper, previous discussant, thinking about the fundamental issue here of causal inference. The presenters were very careful in noting some of the limitations, but I thought it would be useful to go through almost a thought exercise of logical possibilities. And this is a way to organize some of the points that have been raised here as we try to figure out what's going on here. What does it all really mean? One possibility might be labeled the causal marginality scenario. According to this scenario, the main drivers of crime rates in New York City are larger social forces, and policing strategy at its best influences on the margins here. A case might even be made that the estimates of the causal impact that were presented earlier are overstated for some of the features of the research design. A major concern here was referenced moments ago, to use the jargon, is omitted variable bias. Are there other factors that are related to the two things you're studying that are really responsible for the outcome? In observational studies, the way we typically try to deal with this is by introducing explicitly the covariates into the statistical models. I wonder, though, if some of the innovations of the two studies complicates the problem of omitted variable bias, at least in a certain respect. The two studies go beyond prior work. The major innovations here are moving from annual data to monthly data and moving down to street segments. In other words, finer temporal and spatial resolution in the data collection and analysis. But the question that arises for me is then what set of covariates are the appropriate ones to include to deal with omitted variable bias? The paper by Rick and Rob include standard controls in aerial studies in criminology: poverty, racial composition, immigration, residential stability. But it's not clear to me these things are going to be varying much on a monthly basis that's really going to pick up what you're trying to explain. When I may have misread the slide there, but it looked like the effects of the covariates on police stops were trivial in magnitude other than poverty there. And it didn't look like there was much, well, I didn't think there was any attenuation going on when the covariates were entered into the statistical models. In the second paper, the co-integration suggests that there may be a third factor here generating it, and as was acknowledged quite candidly, it's not clear what would they be. So my point here is that much of the observational research here that brings in the kinds of covariates that have been measured, really based on research with a very different substantive focus and theoretical kind of background. And if, of course, the omitted variables are not being taken into account, we may have overestimated what's going on. The limitations of the observational design, any observational design, might lead to a different causal interpretation, one that could be labeled hidden intended effects. Again, I'll begin with the first paper here. The analysis looks at the impact of SQFs in census tracts on the crimes recorded in those census tracts, recognizing that there might be spillover effects to surrounding areas, and these are accommodated by a spatial lag measure. But the problem here, and I suspect the researchers know this, is that if you have a simple contiguity matrix, you're limiting, or you're presupposing that the spatial process is captured by geographic space here. In a city like New York with mass transit and so on, the activity field of offenders might be very diverse and spread out, and it's not clear to me that the design would capture that. There could be much more deterrence actually going on than is being measured. In principle, you can adjust for this if you play around with the spatial weights matrix, but you need to have information that I suspect is not going to be available to you. A third logical possibility that's raised by the researchers, and the sense I get is that this is the one that they are partial to and would subscribe to, and I would label this countervailing causal effects. Much reference has been made to police legitimacy, the possibility of backfire effects. So it's entirely possible, and it seems to me quite plausible, that what's going on is there are causal effects, but they are operating in different directions. In addition to the legitimacy issue, another countervail. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll skip over that because it was mentioned by somebody else here. I think the researchers are definitely on the right track when they're pointing to what we need in the future. Experimental design, yes, that's of course the gold standard for being able to make causal inferences. But the point I would emphasize is that it's going to be very important to think through the processes that we anticipate might be going on when we design the research. And if we think there might be countervailing effects, ask ourselves, have we structured the research in a way that we are going to be able to capture these kinds of effects? And of course, I embrace their overall recommendation that the NYPD should move forward with more research. How can an academic not be in favor of more research? But I think in all seriousness, the time really is a very propitious one, and that this could be extremely valuable if researchers can initiate a project where they look only not at the question of what, if any, is the effect of SQF on crime reduction, but what kinds of practices, under what kinds of circumstances, and through what kinds of processes yield these outcomes. And I think the researchers were clearly pointing in that direction, so I encourage them very much. Thank you.
Well, I was thoroughly intimidated by the statistics, so I'm not going to go there. I'm going to talk more about some of the conceptual issues that I thought were raised by the studies, and then talk a little bit about the idea of legitimacy that David mentioned. The first thing I wanted to mention is it was interesting to me in listening to the papers that there's a certain assumption about the whole framework of stop, question, frisk, and we could say arrest, that I think is not a complete description of what we observe when we see these practices out on the street. The assumption is that the police are concerned about violent crime of the type that the researchers are studying. They're looking for things like guns that are associated with violent crime, and they stop people to search for those. But one of the big issues in this controversy has been the large number of young people who are actually being drawn into the system because of the possession of minor drugs. And so I guess my question is, do we think that's the same thing? That is going after people for having small amounts of marijuana, for example, do we have a model that says that if you carry small amounts of marijuana around, you're more likely to be involved in a violent felony in the future? So we need to do something about you now? If not, then what is the kind of logic of this, and what model of policing is really involved with that proportion of the stops? One theory would be Tanya's theory. It's just a mechanism of social control. But I actually wonder about something different. Often when you hear police officials talking about these strategies, they go back to one of the old chestnuts of criminology, which is broken windows or zero tolerance theory. And that is that if you can stop somebody from urinating on their sidewalk, you stop somebody from being a felon 3 years later. So that by actually going after people for these minor offenses, what you're really doing in the long run is you're preventing major offenses, which would have the advantage of bringing that model of policing into line with the other kind of policing. The reason I mention that is because there's also a research literature on broken windows, on zero tolerance, that suggests that that's absolutely wrong, that that's not a model. And so if, in fact, the underlying assumption of a lot of the stop, question, frisk, and arrest strategies is based upon what's actually a disproven model of causation, we really should be doing research on that and separate it out from the more reasonable argument that carrying a gun might be a predictor of likelihood of committing robbery or something like that. So that's one concern I have, is not differentiating among the different kinds of experiences that stop, question, frisk, and arrest can be about. The other issue that I thought was an important conceptual issue is the one that Robert raised this morning and Dolores just talked about, and that is law. Now, of course, if you teach in a law school, you eventually realize you have to talk about law. So that's why I think, especially to me, the question of policing and law and the intersection of those two things is important. And I was thinking of a very interesting article by David Bailey, where he says that traditionally the police never thought they could control crime. The job of the police was to catch the people who commit crime and gather evidence and send it to the courts. Starting with CompStat, we got this idea that it's possible, and therefore the responsibility of the police, to control crime proactively. And so you have this interesting situation now where you could be a police chief who solved every crime that occurred in your community, and you could still be fired. Because now the view is you should have never let those crimes happen in the first place. To me, the important point about that is it's really changing the relationship of law enforcement to law. And we've talked, several people have talked about the Terry principle and the idea that Terry was actually supposed to be committing a crime at the moment that he was stopped. I mean, who was the police officer? Whoever. The crime was going on at the time. And so the point is, it wasn't about predictive policing. Now what we're seeing is basically massive police activity that's based upon what I would describe as a fiction of suspicion. And Dolores also raised the issue of suspicion. Do we really believe that all of these cards that are filled out with furtive gestures, that the police actually are really thinking about Terry when they're deciding whether to stop these people? And my argument would be that they have a different sense of what their mission is now. And that throws them into an area of preventive policing, and the old legal framework is not working well as a way to constrain police behavior in this new world, where the responsibility the police take on themselves is to be preventive, proactive and preventive, and not to follow the normal, the Terry-like standards of suspicion. So I think those are big issues that we need to think about when we think about how to go forward, talking about police practices like stop, question, frisk. But I specifically want to talk about legitimacy. And the reason that I want to talk about it is I share the concern that Dolores raised. I think it would be easy to write down that the point of this entire meeting was Robert saying that 20% of robbery is prevented by this practice, and David saying that he thought it worked, even if only in the short run. And I'm nervous about that being the tagline of our discussion, even though everyone has been very clear about the caveats. So I want to emphasize the point that I think David made very compellingly, and that is, let's think about other strategies. Are there downsides to this approach, even if we might think it has some good points? And are there other strategies that would be better? Now, David talked very abstractly about legitimacy, and I think it's important to tell you that there is research on the effects of street stops in New York City on the young men, principally, who are stopped, and Jeff Fagan and I have done that research, and it shows that legitimacy is damaged, that mental health is damaged, that the level of criminal behavior goes up, that people are less willing to cooperate with the police, they're less willing to testify in court, so that there are a whole series of negative consequences that come from a loss of legitimacy, and that loss of legitimacy is associated with experiencing police behavior on the streets in the form of stop, question, and frisk. So we have to think about, in very real terms, a trade-off of short and long term. And so I think the question is, what's the message there? One message is that we should ask why people are upset about stop, question, and frisk. And to me, this is one of the central paradoxes of the discussion about stop, question, and frisk. And it's something that Tanya mentioned, but I think it's definitely an important point to reiterate. We can have an intellectual discussion with police officials about, the theory that if you search people for guns, you might get guns and reduce the violence on the street. If you go out and talk to the people that are being stopped, that's not what they're upset about. They're upset about some police officer jumped out of a car when I was walking to school, threw me against a wall, took my backpack, dumped it on the street, made homophobic, racist remarks to me, threatened me, insulted me, demeaned me. Well, what has that actually got to do with legitimate police work? Unless we want to go with Tanya's social control argument, that this is a strategy of intimidation, that it's not really about anything except just intimidating young people and frightening them. I don't want to think that's true. So I think actually one of the good things that comes out of our research is the argument that if the police have legitimate reasons and explain them to people for their actions, and if they treat those people in respectful and decent ways, they don't lose legitimacy when they deal with people on the street or in cars. It's not inevitable that stop, question, and frisk leads to diminished legitimacy. So we could both promote the goal of building lawful behavior, and we can work to try to prevent what I think are undesirable police practices if we pay more attention to the research findings. So I think that that's an important alternative way to think about a future way to go with policing. And David was much more eloquent than I could ever be in making the point about my research, but I'll try to reinforce what he said about the implications. And the thing I would emphasize is it's not just an opinion. It's actually based upon research, but then, of course, like everyone else, I have to say, but of course it wasn't experimental research. And so we have to acknowledge that, and I completely agree with David that what we would all like to have is the ability to do better experimental research. If the NYPD or other entities would do that, I think we would love to design really good studies, and then we would all be much more confident in what we were talking about. So I join David in saying that's a goal for the future for me as well. I hope we can get cooperation to do that. Finally, another strategy I think follows very nicely from David's hotspots strategy, and that is what I'm going to call today hot person strategy, because there is a similar literature on network analysis that suggests that even in high crime neighborhoods, almost all of the crime is committed by a very small group of people who are in the same network. So people like Andrew Papachristos are working in Chicago to identify networks. so that when there is some problem, the police can focus on a network of friends and not have to approach the entire community. So I think we can imagine with hotspots and hot people that the police can direct their energy and attention much more on a high probability group of potential offenders and can work much more with the general community to build cooperative relationships and not treat people who are low probability offenders in a way that communicates suspicion and distrust of them.